Before we start, leave a comment with your location and the time. Context matters more than it seems. This video asks a question that seems simple, but becomes harder the longer it sits with you. What does it actually mean to call a Lovecraftian monster scary? Not dangerous, not violent. Scary in the sense that it changes how you think after you encounter it. H.P. Lovecraft was writing between 1917 and 1937, a period when science was rapidly stripping humanity of its assumed importance. His monsters emerged directly from that shift. They are not obstacles to overcome. They are facts to endure. Consider this carefully. Many fictional creatures frightened by attacking bodies or cities. Lovecraft's most disturbing creations do something quieter. They suggest that reality itself operates on principles that do not include us. Some are vast but mindless. Others are intelligent but uninterested. A few can communicate, which may be the most unsettling trait of all. The fear does not come from what they do, but from what their existence implies. We must pause here, because ranking such entities is already a mistake. There is no single form of terror at work. Instead, there are different failures of meaning, each embodied by a different figure. In the sections that follow, we will move carefully through 5 such monsters, tracing where they came from, how they function in the stories, and why they continue to unsettle modern readers long after the pages are closed. H.P. Lovecraft's most unsettling monsters did not emerge from folklore or superstition, but from a specific historical fracture. He wrote primarily between 1917 and his death in 1937, a period when scientific developments were quietly dismantling humanity's inherited sense of centrality. Astronomy had expanded the universe beyond comprehension. Biology had reduced humans to a contingent branch of evolution. Anthropology had revealed civilizations rising and vanishing without moral narrative. Lovecraft absorbed these shifts intensely, not as abstract ideas, but as existential pressures. His monsters are shaped less by fear of death than by fear of irrelevance. They exist because the modern world made it increasingly difficult to believe that reality was arranged for human meaning. Lovecraft's personal background sharpened this response. He was deeply invested in Enlightenment rationalism, classical order, and hierarchical systems of knowledge. At the same time, he lived in an era when those systems were failing to explain the universe they revealed. This contradiction matters. Lovecraft did not reject science. He trusted it. The terror arises precisely because science keeps working. Telescopes do not comfort. Mathematics does not reassure. New data simply expands the scale of indifference. His monsters are not supernatural intrusions. They are logical consequences of a universe that operates according to impersonal laws. This reveals something profound. The horror is not that reality is hostile, but that it is structurally uninterested. We must pause here to correct a common misunderstanding. Lovecraft did not set out to invent a pantheon of frightening creatures. According to his letters from the 1920s and early 1930s, his stated aim was to evoke a cosmic fear grounded in atmosphere rather than plot. The entities later labeled monsters were narrative tools, not focal points. Many barely appear on the page. Some are never fully described. Their function is explanatory, not confrontational. They exist to account for sensations the human mind cannot comfortably process. Scale without purpose, time without direction, intelligence without empathy. The stories are structured to leave readers with implications, not images. This intent becomes clearer when we compare Lovecraft to earlier horror traditions. Gothic fiction from the late 18th through 19th centuries framed fear around transgression and punishment. Something goes wrong, a boundary is crossed, consequences follow. Lovecraft removes this structure entirely. There is no original sin and no restoration. The universe was already wrong, or rather never aligned with human values to begin with. His monsters embody this condition, not evil, but incompatible. Not attackers, but cohabitants. This shift marks a decisive break in horror history, aligning fear with ontology rather than morality. Specific historical moments sharpened this worldview. The aftermath of World War I demonstrated that technological progress did not guarantee ethical progress. The 1920s saw rapid urbanization, mass media, and new theories of the unconscious destabilizing individual identity. Freud's work suggested that even the mind was not sovereign. Lovecraft internalized these developments selectively but powerfully. His monsters often mirror bureaucratic, scientific, or institutional forms. They are vast systems that continue operating regardless of individual suffering. Consider this carefully. The terror does not come from chaos. It comes from order that excludes us. Lovecraft's correspondence further clarifies creator intent. In letters to Clark Ashton Smith and others, he repeatedly emphasized mood over resolution and implication over explanation. He resisted attempts, even by close collaborators, to systematize his entities. Classification would suggest mastery. Mastery would neutralize dread. This is why contradictions persist across stories. Dates do not align. Attributes shift. The monsters refuse to settle into stable definitions. This instability is not careless. It is structural. The reader's desire to understand becomes part of the horror mechanism itself. By situating these monsters within their historical and intellectual moment, we see that their power lies less in invention than in synthesis. Lovecraft gathered scientific anxiety, philosophical pessimism, and cultural disorientation into figures that feel disturbingly plausible. They do not threaten the world. They explain it in ways that leave no room for comfort. In the next subsection, we will trace the older cultural and philosophical currents that made this synthesis possible, revealing that Lovecraft's vision, however extreme, did not arise in isolation. Lovecraft's monsters did not appear in a vacuum. Their defining qualities, indifference, vastness, incomprehensibility, echo earlier systems of thought that treated reality as something fundamentally alien to human perception. Long before cosmic horror had a name, traditions across philosophy, religion, and literature had already begun asking whether the universe had any place for human meaning. What Lovecraft did, uniquely, was absorb these threads and reframe them through fiction that rejected anthropocentrism altogether. One early antecedent lies in ancient atomist philosophy, particularly the writings of Democritus and Lucretius. In De Rerum Natura, Lucretius describes a universe governed not by gods, but by blind material forces. Atoms fall through void. Randomness and necessity rule. The gods, if they exist, remain uninvolved. This perspective, the absence of divine intention, creates a vision of reality that parallels Azathoth more than Yahweh. Lovecraft likely never read Lucretius directly, but the echo is unmistakable. A system without moral alignment, where chaos and order coexist without purpose. The fear this induces is not divine punishment, but total exclusion. Gnostic thought offers a darker theological mirror. In many Gnostic texts, the creator of the world is not a benevolent deity, but a malformed demiurge, an ignorant power who mistakes himself for God. The material world, in this schema, is a prison built from error. Here, too, we find an early model of existential horror. Reality is not simply flawed, but constructed by something fundamentally alien to goodness or truth. While Lovecraft had little sympathy for religious metaphysics, his monsters behave in Gnostic fashion. They shape worlds not through malevolence, but through distorted necessity. Their creations, us included, exist without consent or meaning. We must also consider philosophical pessimism, especially in the work of Arthur Schopenhauer and later Peter Wessel Zapffe. Schopenhauer posited that existence is suffering, driven by a blind will that cannot be satisfied. Zapffe extended this to argue that consciousness itself is a tragic overdevelopment, granting humans awareness without power. These ideas align closely with Lovecraft's own remarks in personal letters, where he describes life as a meaningless jest and praises oblivion over persistence. His monsters embody this pessimism not as attitude, but as structure. They are what reality looks like when meaning is not assumed. Modern science added further destabilization. After 1859, Darwin's Origin of Species severed the connection between humanity and divine intention. Evolution did not require guidance. The result was not dignity, but accident. Lovecraft embraced this conclusion. His creatures are not deviations from nature. They are expressions of a deeper naturalism, one unconcerned with human value. Where Gothic horror relies on the unnatural, Lovecraftian horror often relies on the hypernatural. Shub-Niggurath, for example, is not a perversion of life, but an overwhelming intensification of it. Fertility becomes monstrous not through corruption, but through abundance without meaning. Consider also the influence of fin de siècle literature, particularly writers like Thomas Hardy and Joseph Conrad. Hardy's impersonal cosmos and Conrad's impenetrable jungles presented nature as mute and hostile to moral interpretation. These themes reappear in Lovecraft's isolated landscapes and unknowable ruins. But where Hardy leaves space for endurance and Conrad for moral ambiguity, Lovecraft strips both away. His world offers no ethical response. There is no resistance, only delayed recognition. Even within horror itself, precursors existed. Algernon Blackwood's The Willows, 1907, presents unseen forces that are neither evil nor good, merely incompatible with human existence. William Hope Hodgson's The House on the Borderland, 1908, expands reality into temporal and spatial vastness that renders identity meaningless. Lovecraft admired both authors. He borrowed their sense of scale, but replaced their mysticism with scientific rigor. His monsters do not haunt, they explain. These antecedents reveal that Lovecraft did not invent cosmic horror so much as crystallize it. He fused metaphysical despair, scientific indifference, and literary restraint into a new form that made fear structural rather than situational. By drawing from these sources without resolving their contradictions, he created monsters that do not symbolize evil, but embody irrelevance. In the next section, we will examine how this irrelevance is encoded in language, specifically how Lovecraft's names, sounds, and symbols destabilize meaning before any image is formed. Lovecraft's monsters begin unsettling the reader before they appear. Often, they never appear at all, not in clear detail. Their names do the first and deepest damage. Cthulhu, Nyarlathotep, Azathoth. These are not merely unfamiliar, they are engineered to resist interpretation. Lovecraft understood that horror begins when language fails. If the mind cannot categorize what it hears, it cannot prepare for what follows. Phonetics becomes a tool of unease. In letters from the late 1920s, Lovecraft admitted that he designed these names to suggest linguistic systems that predate human speech. He favored hard consonants, irregular vowel clusters, and stress patterns that break conventional syllabic rhythm. This is not decorative. It mimics the experience of hearing something intelligible, but not translatable. As he wrote to Clark Ashton Smith, these names were meant to convey instant suggestion of abysmal and blasphemous antiquity. Their effect is immediate disorientation, familiarity denied at the phoneme level. Consider this carefully. Most monsters in folklore and literature come with names that signify role or nature. Dracula, derived from dragon. Behemoth, from Hebrew, beast. Wendigo, from Algonquian lore, evil spirit. Lovecraft's entities reject this tradition. Their names are not identifiers. They are intrusions. We are not meant to understand them, only to stumble over them. The name Yog-Sothoth functions less like a title and more like a ritual glitch, repeating syllables that feel recursive, unstable, closed off to comprehension. It does not invite you in, it warns you away. We must pause here because this approach reflects a larger pattern in Lovecraft's fiction, the collapse of epistemic confidence. His stories are littered with failed texts, mistranslations, and damaged manuscripts. The infamous Necronomicon is a book that no one understands, entirely, even those who study it. Names in Lovecraft's work carry the same ambiguity. They promise knowledge, but offer only distortion. The more precisely a scholar defines a term, the less stable it becomes. This is not accidental. It is the architecture of the horror itself. In this context, naming becomes symbolic violation. To name something implies a relationship. It implies distance bridged, chaos tamed. Lovecraft reverses this. Naming marks the moment when distance collapses and containment fails. In the Dunwich Horror, the name Yog-Sothoth is uttered in ritual, but the result is not clarity. It is genealogical contamination. In the Call of Cthulhu, the name appears in dreams, but cannot be pronounced the same way twice. Language becomes not a tool for mapping reality, but a signal that reality has escaped the map. There is an important connection here to linguistic relativism, the idea that language shapes thought. Lovecraft anticipates this without theorizing it. By disrupting language, he disrupts cognition. If you cannot articulate a fear, you cannot locate it. His monsters operate in this linguistic blind spot. They are not seen. They are intuited through failure of speech, of syntax, of script. The famous phrase, "the thing cannot be described," is not laziness. It is a tactical decision. Description would normalize. Ambiguity destabilizes. This strategy aligns Lovecraft with certain modernist writers who also use language to fracture meaning. T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, 1922, and James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake, 1939, both dismantle linguistic structure to evoke breakdown. But where Eliot aimed for cultural mourning and Joyce for linguistic liberation, Lovecraft pursued cognitive erosion. His neologisms don't merely complicate, they contaminate. The reader isn't simply confused. They are implicated in a structure they cannot navigate. By destabilizing language at the root, Lovecraft forces the reader into a state of interpretive paralysis. Naming no longer provides comfort or control. It becomes a sign that one has already ventured too far. This is why many readers report that Lovecraft's stories are more disturbing after the fact. The language leaves residue. It disables resolution. In the next section, we will see how Lovecraft extends this technique through narrative form itself, building entire mythologies that refuse internal consistency, not by accident, but as a deliberate strategy to deepen unease. Lovecraft's monsters gain power not from what they do, but from how they are framed. through fragments, contradictions, and unresolved accounts that suggest coherence without confirming it. Unlike most horror fiction, which centralizes the creature for dramatic confrontation, Lovecraft buries his entities behind layers of false documents, hearsay, linguistic distortion, and missing pieces. This is not merely stylistic. It is foundational to how the monsters function. They are not threats to be defeated. They are realities to be slowly, disastrously recognized. This technique of pseudo-authenticity, blending invented scholarship with real historical and geographical details, creates the illusion that the monster mythos was discovered, not created. Stories such as the Dunwich Horror and the Call of Cthulhu are structured around found materials: diaries, newspaper clippings, police transcripts, academic letters. The result is what critics call the documentary effect, a narrative strategy that mimics the tone and texture of academic investigation, even while recounting the impossible. The horror lies in the tone of certainty, not spectacle. The world appears logical until it is not. We must pause here to observe a pattern. Lovecraft's most iconic monsters rarely appear directly. Cthulhu slumbers. Yog-Sothoth remains mostly theoretical. Shub-Niggurath is invoked but never depicted. This absence is not withholding. It is architectural. The less these entities are seen, the more they expand. The reader's mind is forced to imagine across gaps, connecting fragmentary descriptions, contradictory reports, and obscure names into something far larger than any single image. This is how myth functions, not as clear doctrine, but as persistent implication. Lovecraft's myth-building gains further strength from contradiction. His letters confirm that he saw no need for internal consistency. Stories contradict each other in dates, creature abilities, cosmology, and geography. For example, Nyarlathotep's role shifts wildly, from a shape-shifting manipulator in one text to a nearly elemental force in another. Rather than explain these inconsistencies, Lovecraft left them unresolved. Why? Because contradiction deepens mystery. In real-world mythology, contradictions are common. Different cultures interpret the same figure through divergent lenses. Lovecraft imports this chaos deliberately, creating a mythos that resists systematization and remains alive because it refuses to stabilize. This refusal undermines genre expectations. Most fictional universes, whether religious, mythic, or fantastical, offer internally coherent systems. Lovecraft offers something closer to cumulative dread. The Necronomicon, for example, never appears in full. Its contents are never cataloged. Its effects shift depending on the story. Yet it functions as a recurring anchor point, a dark gravitational center, pulling disparate tales into mutual orbit. It offers just enough familiarity to unify the mythos without ever being understood. The reader is given fragments, and it is in trying to assemble them that fear begins to crystallize. There is a deeper function to this narrative strategy. It replicates the experience of encountering forbidden knowledge. The scholar or narrator begins with certainty, finds anomalies, and slowly loses grip as each discovery deepens the discrepancy between what is known and what is real. The reader undergoes the same process. The stories don't simply present horror, they enact it through form. This is what makes the monsters feel real, not because they are described, but because the failure to describe them feels plausible. Lovecraft's approach mirrors myth in one final way. It invites collaboration. From the beginning, fellow writers like Clark Ashton Smith and August Derleth expanded the mythos, sometimes with Lovecraft's guidance, often without. the openness of the framework, gaps, contradictions, ambiguities, allowed for a decentralized, participatory mythology. This is how real myth survives, not by consistency, but by adaptability. Even today, games, films, and fiction continue to add new layers to Lovecraft's entities, drawing on the same technique: fragmentation, implication, incompletion. In the next section, we will move from structure to substance. Having established how Lovecraft's monsters are introduced, we now examine what they mean. What philosophical concepts do they embody? What kind of universe do they imply? To answer this, we begin with the core ideas behind cosmic horror itself: insignificance, entropy, and unstable reality. Cosmic horror begins not with violence or monstrosity, but with perspective. In Lovecraft's work, fear is rarely centered on death. Instead, it grows from realization, slow, irreversible, that the human mind is not equipped to comprehend the universe it inhabits. This realization is structured around three recurring concepts: insignificance, entropy, and unstable reality. Together, they create a world where terror emerges not from violation, but from recognition. The concept of insignificance appears most clearly in The Call of Cthulhu, 1928, where the narrator concludes, "The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents." This is not poetic despair. It is philosophical diagnosis. The problem is not that the world is hostile, but that it is structured in a way that excludes human relevance. Cthulhu does not target humanity. It dreams beneath the sea, unaware. The threat is not intention, but scale. Lovecraft's monsters are not terrifying because they see us, but because they do not. We must pause here. In traditional horror, the unknown is frightening because it may harm us. In Lovecraft, the unknown is frightening because it renders our categories meaningless. This shift is foundational. When the universe has no special regard for humans, moral frameworks collapse. Lovecraft called this cosmic indifference and considered it a defining feature of modern thought. His stories are not about being hunted. They are about realizing we were never central. This aligns closely with the second concept, entropy. Lovecraft's cosmos is not merely indifferent, but decaying. Time does not heal. Knowledge does not progress. Civilizations rise only to fall, often leaving behind fragments that warp or erase the meaning of what came before. In At the Mountains of Madness, 1936, the discovery of the Elder Things murals reveals a once great race that created life on Earth, only to be destroyed by their own creations. The horror lies in the pattern: creation, ascendance, collapse. No moral arc, no lesson, just loss. Entropy in Lovecraft is not just physical, it is epistemological. As more is uncovered, less is understood. Knowledge accumulates without coherence. The narrator of The Shadow Out of Time, 1936, experiences this directly. His consciousness projected across vast gulfs of time, gaining infinite knowledge only to return to a present where that knowledge means nothing. The more he knows, the more he disintegrates. This is not knowledge as empowerment, but knowledge as erosion. The third core concept, unstable or dream-based reality, destabilizes perception itself. In The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, 1927, Lovecraft constructs a parallel realm governed by dream, logic, where cause and effect break down and identity becomes porous. Unlike fantasy realms designed for adventure or wonder, the dreamlands are recursive and disorienting. Time folds inwards, space flickers. Individuals forget who they are. This is not escape, it is dislocation. The dreamlands do not free the dreamer, they dissolve him. This idea echoes across other stories. In The Dreams in the Witch House, 1933, the protagonist's exposure to non-Euclidean geometries leads to dreams that bleed into waking life. He travels across dimensions but cannot control when or how. Dreams become not refuge, but invasion. Reality itself loses its boundaries. The horror lies not in a different world, but in the realization that this one may never have been stable to begin with. Together, these three concepts form the philosophical core of Lovecraftian horror. Insignificance removes moral center. Entropy denies progress. Unstable reality erodes perception. The result is not spectacle, but philosophical erosion, a slow undoing of meaning, identity, and place. Readers are not asked to fear pain or death, but to question whether anything they believe about existence can remain intact when faced with the true scale of things. In the next section, we will turn from these abstract forces to the entities that embody them. These are not characters in the traditional sense, but functions within the cosmos, expressions of blind chaos, total knowledge, or endlessly mutating life. Each will be examined not for what it looks like, but for what kind of disturbance it represents. In Lovecraft's cosmology, the entities often called monsters are not adversaries. They are not evil, cunning, or even necessarily alive in the human sense. They are expressions of deeper structures, embodiments of entropy, scale, or cognition pushed to the point of collapse. To understand why they are terrifying, we must abandon the language of antagonism and examine them as philosophical constructs. Each major entity occupies a different position in Lovecraft's conceptual system. Their terror lies not in form or power, but in the kind of error they reveal about how we interpret reality. Start with Azathoth, the blind idiot god, who gnaws hungrily in chaos beyond time and space. He appears nowhere directly, only in references, always at the center of the universe, where he sleeps mindlessly while flutes are played to keep him unconscious. This is not a ruler, it is a gravitational fact, a figure so devoid of intelligence that all of creation spirals around it without intention. Azathoth is the embodiment of a mechanistic universe. No will, no purpose, only infinite motion. Consider this carefully. The most powerful being in Lovecraft's mythos is not malevolent, but vacant. The fear here is not destruction. It is cosmic function without meaning. By contrast, Nyarlathotep is active, intelligent, and communicative. Often called the crawling chaos, he walks the world in human guise, speaks in riddles, and inspires cults. But he does not kill or conquer. He destabilizes. In The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, he mocks the protagonist's assumptions about agency. In other stories, he spreads madness not through cruelty, but through knowledge. Nyarlathotep is a cognitive weapon. He shows humans the truth, and the truth undoes them. He represents terror that arrives not with violence, but with precision. Unlike Azathoth, he is not chaos as absence. He is chaos as delivery system. The third axis is occupied by Yog-Sothoth, a being described as coterminous with all time and space. He is not in the universe, he is the universe, or at least the connective tissue of it. In The Dunwich Horror, he fathers a monstrous child with a human woman, resulting in an entity that can phase in and out of visible dimensions. But the act is not seduction or invasion, it is proximity error. Yog-Sothoth is total knowledge, all timelines, all positions, all truths simultaneously. The horror is not that he sees you, but that everything is always seen. Identity, secrecy, linearity. These break down in his presence. He is not evil. He is the collapse of epistemic boundaries. Where these entities embody structure, Shub-Niggurath represents biological excess. Known as the black goat of the woods with 1,000 young, she is associated with uncontrolled fertility, spawning nameless offspring in wild, chaotic abundance. Importantly, she does not represent decay or corruption. Her horror comes from unchecked creation, life without telos. In modern ecological terms, she is not a blight, but a system out of balance, generating faster than meaning can keep up. Shub-Niggurath is not motherly. She is reproductive logic unhinged from purpose. And then there is Cthulhu, the most iconic yet least understood of Lovecraft's beings. Trapped beneath the Pacific Ocean, he exerts influence not through action, but through dreams. When he briefly rises in the Call of Cthulhu, it is not to destroy, but to be seen, massive, alien, and incomprehensible. He is described as dead but dreaming, which is not metaphor. It is ontological confusion. Cthulhu is persistence without wakefulness, presence without intervention. He induces madness not through force, but through partial recognition. The mind cannot reconcile the scale, the shape, the reality of him. Cthulhu is not terrifying because of what he does. He is terrifying because he remains. These 5 entities, Azathoth, Nyarlathotep, Yog-Sothoth, Shub-Niggurath, and Cthulhu, function like philosophical operators. Each reveals a different limit of human thought. One collapses agency, one erodes reason, one overwhelms knowledge, one distorts biology, one destabilizes perception. Their appearances are rare. Their motives are unknowable. Their effect is permanent. Once they are introduced, even briefly, the structure of the narrative and of reality itself changes. We must pause here, because what Lovecraft offers is not hierarchy, but taxonomy. These are not levels of power. They are modes of disruption. The question is not which is strongest, but which kind of unknowing is most unbearable. In the next section, we explore what happens when humans encounter these forces directly, not in battle, but in contact. The result is rarely death. More often, it is madness, not as illness, but as a final stage of recognition. In Lovecraft's universe, terror emerges not from the monstrous body, but from the human response to encountering forces that exist outside our conceptual frameworks. The traditional horror arc, threat, confrontation, survival, is inverted. In Lovecraft, the deeper the understanding, the greater the dissolution. Contact with outer entities rarely kills. It ruptures identity, cognition, and meaning. Madness, in this context, is not loss of reason, but its final, most accurate form. It is what happens when reason is applied to an unreasonable universe and yields no usable result. We must pause here. Madness in cosmic horror is not a pathology. It is a function. The moment of revelation, when a human sees or understands even a fragment of an entity, like Yog-Sothoth or Cthulhu, is not a transformation, but a stripping away. In the Call of Cthulhu, multiple characters descend into mental disarray after glimpsing Cthulhu's dream image or merely handling an ancient idol. They are not attacked. They are exposed. Their minds do not fail because of weakness. They fail because the data they have acquired does not fit into the architecture of thought. Consider The Shadow Out of Time, 1936, in which a professor experiences a temporal consciousness swap with an alien being from the distant past. He returns to his body, haunted not by delusions, but by memories of a civilization so old and vast that it renders all of human history insignificant. The horror here is purely cognitive. His madness is not about hallucination, but about having seen too much. Lovecraft builds a world in which understanding is incompatible with mental cohesion. The more one knows, the less one can remain what one was. This kind of madness differs sharply from earlier literary models. In Gothic fiction, madness often results from guilt, trauma, or forbidden desire. It is internal, symbolic, and reversible. In Lovecraft, madness is structural. It is not about individual failure. It is the logical outcome of epistemic contact. The mind, confronted with reality's true scope, bends and finally snaps. The result is not delusion, but dissociation. The self is no longer a viable container for the knowledge it holds. Importantly, madness is not always depicted as suffering. Some characters, particularly cultists or ritual practitioners, appear to embrace their altered state. In the Dunwich Horror, the Whateleys call out to Yog-Sothoth with purpose and pride. In the Dreams in the Witch House, the protagonist begins by resisting his dream-induced journeys, but eventually participates, until the boundaries collapse. These figures are not insane in the conventional sense. They are adapted. They function within a logic that is alien to the reader. The horror here is cultural, a reminder that what looks like madness from one perspective may be coherence from another. This introduces a crucial ambiguity. Madness in Lovecraft is not merely a symptom of exposure. It may also be a precondition. Those who interact with cosmic forces are often outsiders, recluses, occultists, scholars of dead languages. Their marginality opens them to revelations that ordinary people resist, but it also renders them vulnerable. In Lovecraft's fiction, sanity is a filter. It protects, but it also blinds. To lose it may be ruin, or truth. This is the unsettling proposition at the core of his work. Madness may be the only accurate response to an accurate model of the universe. We must also consider the narrative function of madness. It is often the end point of the story. The narrator survives, but is left shattered, discredited, institutionalized. In this way, madness becomes a seal, closing off the knowledge, quarantining it. The reader, however, is not shielded. They have been made complicit. By following the narrator's descent, they too are exposed to the implications. This is what gives Lovecraftian horror its lingering effect. The monster is gone. The damage is permanent. In the next section, we explore what lies beneath these episodes of collapse, the texts, rituals, and revelations that trigger them. Madness, we will see, is not caused by random encounter. It is most often the result of forbidden knowledge, a category that does not mean evil or taboo, but simply unusable. The following section traces how information, once accessed, becomes corrosive. In cosmic horror, the most dangerous weapon is not a tentacle or a claw. It is a sentence, a diagram, a memory. Lovecraft's monsters are rarely defeated because they rarely attack. Instead, they are revealed, often through text. This knowledge does not empower. It does not clarify. It contaminates. It breaks the system that tries to hold it. In Lovecraft's world, knowledge is forbidden not because it is secret or sacred, but because the mind that gains it cannot remain intact. Forbidden knowledge is that which renders the knower structurally incompatible with human life. The Necronomicon, Lovecraft's most infamous fictional book, embodies this principle. It does not summon demons in a dramatic sense. It rearranges understanding. Readers of the book do not become villains. They become destabilized. In the Dunwich Horror, the text allows scholars to intervene against a hybrid being spawned by Yog-Sothoth, but their success is partial, belated, and ethically murky. The danger is not what the book causes directly, but what it enables: contact with systems no human should map. We must pause here. Forbidden knowledge in Lovecraft is not hidden behind locked doors. It is often available, buried in archives, misfiled in libraries, passed down in half-remembered rituals. The problem is not access, it is interpretation. In The Whisperer in Darkness, recordings of non-human voices and maps of distant stars begin as scientific curiosities. They end as vectors of ontological collapse. The closer the characters come to clarity, the more their frameworks disintegrate. Knowledge expands beyond the scale of meaning. Epistemology collapses under its own weight. This process is not exclusive to ancient texts. Dreams are equally dangerous. In the Call of Cthulhu, cultists around the globe receive visions of the sleeping god, not as prophecy, but as infection. The dreams do not offer instruction. They broadcast presence. The recipients do not go mad because they misunderstand. They go mad because the information is incompatible with sanity. This is Lovecraft's most disturbing contribution, that madness is not a break from reality, but its byproduct. When humans grasp truths too large, too alien, or too simultaneous, the result is not enlightenment. It is psychic burn. The recurring pattern is this: a character uncovers a piece of knowledge, attempts to integrate it, and is undone. Not always instantly. Often the collapse is delayed, hidden beneath rationalization. In The Shadow Out of Time, Professor Peasley believes he is recovering from amnesia. Only gradually does he realize that his consciousness had been replaced. The information he gains about prehistoric alien cultures and deep time can be written down, even published, but it does not restore him. It isolates him. Forbidden knowledge severs the knower from the shared delusion of human centrality. We must consider the broader philosophical implication. In Lovecraft's work, forbidden knowledge is not protected to preserve power, as in political thrillers. Nor is it forbidden by dogma, as in religious horror. It is forbidden because it cannot be used. There is no spell to cast, no portal to control. Learning the name of an outer god does not grant mastery. It grants proximity, and proximity, in this context, is erasure. This reverses the heroic narrative of many speculative genres, where learning the ancient truth empowers the protagonist. Lovecraft offers no such resolution. The truth is not a tool, it is a solvent. This idea, truth as solvent, marks a turning point in modern horror. Lovecraft's epistemic collapse has become a recognizable trope. The scholar who learns too much, the journalist who reads the wrong file, the scientist whose discovery ends civilization. But in Lovecraft, the trope is not narrative. It is thematic. It is the point. The collapse of knowing is the end state. The only resolution is retreat, denial, or madness. In the next section, we shift from philosophy to literature. We've examined how these entities function, conceptually, how they embody terror through absence, presence, and perception. Now we ask, how did Lovecraft first build them? Which stories contain their earliest appearances? How did later tales expand or contradict those origins? We begin by tracing the intertextual structure of his mythos, how creatures, books, and names reappear across works to form something that looks like a universe, but behaves like a dream. Lovecraft did not begin with a unified mythos. His most terrifying entities emerged gradually, across disconnected stories, only later acquiring the appearance of cohesion. Their earliest appearances were often incidental, mentioned briefly, ambiguously described, or embedded in the background of unrelated narratives. This fragmentary construction was not a flaw. It was a method. Rather than introduce monsters with clarity, Lovecraft allowed them to haunt the text. Their reality accumulates across works, felt before it is explained. The first faint echoes appear in Dagon, 1917, often regarded as the prototype for Lovecraft's mythic sea beings. Here, the narrator encounters a thing which had risen from the bottom of the sea, a creature that inspires instant revulsion and existential dread. There is no name, no clear origin, just this. It loomed like a giant, distorted human figure, covered with awful scales. The description anticipates Cthulhu in both appearance and narrative function. Not as antagonist, but as symptom. The creature's presence signals a world misaligned with human understanding. Already the formula is in place. Knowledge as contamination, sight as collapse. The Nameless City, 1921, introduces another early motif. The ruins of a pre-human civilization whose architecture denies human scale. As the narrator descends deeper into the catacombs, he confronts not monsters, but incompatible proportions. He cannot process the dimensions. The horror lies in geometry, not gore. Though no outer god is named, the story marks Lovecraft's first use of non-Euclidean description to destabilize the reader's perception. It also begins the tradition of the narrator returning from the brink, not triumphant, but disturbed. This ending, survival as curse, becomes standard in later texts. We must pause here to examine The Hound, 1922, a seemingly conventional Gothic tale that nevertheless contains the first mention of the Necronomicon. The book is introduced in passing, its contents undefined, its author named as Abdul al-Hazred. This small insertion is crucial. It creates a false referentiality, a sense that the book, and by extension the mythos, has history outside the narrative. Lovecraft would return to this technique repeatedly, planting fictional texts, names, and dates that recur across stories, building an illusion of independent mythic depth. The Call of Cthulhu, 1926, published 1928, marks the turning point. Here, for the first time, Lovecraft constructs a full narrative around one of his entities, integrating prior motifs, ancient ruins, cult fragments, dreams, geometrical distortions, into a cohesive structure. Cthulhu is introduced through secondary sources, sculpture, dreams, sailor accounts, and scholarly research. He does not act, he exists, and his existence is corrosive. The famous line, "That is not dead, which can eternal lie, and with strange aeons even death may die," places Cthulhu within a timeline that renders human history microscopic. The story's structure, composed of recovered documents, echoes the mythos itself, assembled, not revealed. Intertextuality deepens with The Dunwich Horror, 1928, published 1929, which introduces Yog-Sothoth explicitly. This being does not appear on the page. Its effects are visible through ritual, mutation, and unnatural birth. The child of Yog-Sothoth, Wilbur Whately, grows at a terrifying rate and speaks in archaic, non-human tongues. When his invisible twin is finally destroyed, it screams, "I don't want to go back to the dad. I want to stay with you. I hate it." This line destabilizes the mythos further. The monsters are not distant. They are familial. Yog-Sothoth is not just a cosmic concept. It is ancestral. The human lineage is no longer secure. This thematic entanglement reaches its apex in The Whisperer in Darkness, 1930, where the Mygo, fungal beings from Yuggoth, interact with humans directly, offering knowledge in exchange for the removal of brains to be stored in metal canisters. This fusion of science fiction and horror reflects Lovecraft's shift from mythic past to cosmic present. The threat is no longer ancient alone, it is ongoing. More importantly, this story links prior entities. Nyarlathotep is mentioned, Yuggoth is tied to Pluto, and the Necronomicon reappears. These are not Easter eggs. They are lateral connections, giving the impression of a world with edges that touch, but never align. Lovecraft's stories do not form a perfect web. They form a shadow network, nodes of meaning linked by implication rather than continuity. No timeline holds, no taxonomy endures. And yet, the impression of depth grows with each text. Entities appear, vanish, reappear in new roles. The Necronomicon is both a key and a red herring. Nyarlathotep is both a messenger and a god. Cthulhu is both dormant and active. This instability is the point. The mythos resists resolution by design. In the next section, we will isolate one of these stories, the Call of Cthulhu, and examine how its structure, language, and epistemic mechanisms establish not just the monster, but the method by which Lovecraft would influence a century of horror writing. The monster itself is not the climax. The structure of knowing is. The Call of Cthulhu, written 1926, published 1928, is the axis upon which Lovecraft's mythos rotates. It is not his first horror story, nor the most graphically frightening, but it is the moment when his core aesthetic, dread by implication, solidifies. The story does not rely on confrontation. Instead, it constructs a vast, multi-layered architecture of information. Newspaper clippings, sculptural analyses, first-person logs, academic fragments. Cthulhu himself is glimpsed only momentarily, and even that sighting remains ambiguous. The real horror lies in how the story teaches us to see, and how what we see cannot be fully grasped. From the opening paragraph, Lovecraft signals the epistemological stakes. The most merciful thing in the world is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. This is a mission statement, not an observation. The narrator, Francis Thurston, proceeds to do exactly what the story warns against: correlating. He assembles data from disparate sources, and in doing so, brings into partial focus something that cannot be fully seen. The structure of the story enacts the very process it critiques. The monster is not just Cthulhu, it is the synthesis itself. The story's central figure, Cthulhu, is not a god in the classical sense. He is not omnipotent, omniscient, or even especially active. He dreams. He exerts unconscious influence. He affects minds across the globe, particularly artists and the sensitive, who are tormented by visions and impulses they cannot explain. A pulpy, tentacled head surmounted a grotesque and scaly body. The general outline suggested an anthropoid, but the head was that of a cephalopod. The description is vivid but fragmentary, filtered through sculpture, dreams, and panic. This is critical. The creature resists full presence. Cthulhu's horror lies not in action, but in unavoidable incompleteness. We are given just enough to realize we cannot understand. Consider the narrative's climax, the sailor Johansson's encounter with R'lyeh, the risen city of Cthulhu. The geometry is described as loathsomely redolent of spheres and dimensions apart from ours. The structures do not obey human angles. The architecture alone causes disorientation. When Cthulhu rises, he does not attack so much as appear. A mountain walked or stumbled. The sailors flee. One dies from terror. Another is crushed. Then the city sinks again. The god is neither victorious nor defeated. He returns to sleep. The event does not resolve. It echoes. The reader is left not with an answer, but but with a question that cannot be formed. We must pause here. Most horror stories end with either triumph or loss. The Call of Cthulhu ends with recognition. The narrator states, "I shall never sleep calmly again when I think of the horrors that lurk ceaselessly behind life." His only action is withdrawal. He will keep the knowledge to himself. This is the Lovecraftian endgame. Survival not as victory, but as containment. The narrator lives, but he no longer belongs to the world he understood. The knowledge cannot be shared, not because it is secret, but because it is structurally unusable. The story also introduces key mythological scaffolding. The Necronomicon is cited multiple times, not as a magical object, but as a source of failed understanding. Its content confuses more than it clarifies. The global cult of Cthulhu is described in chilling detail, yet their beliefs remain half wrong, riddled with misinterpretations. Even the faithful do not understand what they worship. The language of their chant, Finglui Maglunaf Cthulhu Relier Wagah Nagul Ftagen, is untranslated, resisting assimilation. This aligns with a broader motif. Proximity to the truth does not grant clarity. It invites collapse. Intertextual connections deepen the effect. The swamps of Louisiana, the dreams of New England artists, the Norwegian sailor's account. All these threads converge without closure. What binds them is not narrative logic, but ontological pressure. Cthulhu is not pursuing them. He doesn't need to. His existence alone generates consequences. This is what separates Lovecraft from conventional horror. The monster is not a character. It is a structural failure. In later stories, Lovecraft would expand the mythos, introduce new entities, and deepen the cosmology. But the pattern established here remains foundational: fragmented perception, decentralized threat, irreversible knowledge. The Call of Cthulhu teaches the reader how to read Lovecraft, slowly, suspiciously, with an awareness that every glimpse obscures more than it reveals. In the next section, we will turn to the Dunwich Horror, where a different kind of terror unfolds, not from the sea, but from the land. There, we will trace how Yog-Sothoth enters the mythos, not as a being to be worshipped, but as a biological event that erases the boundary between cosmic and human. If the Call of Cthulhu introduced the mythos through scale and alien geometry, the Dunwich Horror, written 1928, published 1929, brings it uncomfortably close to home. Set in rural Massachusetts, the story begins as local folklore and ends in cosmological violation. Here, the terror is not distant or sleeping. It is familial, inherited, and partially human. Where Cthulhu dreams beneath the sea, Yog-Sothoth impregnates a woman, and the resulting child grows up in a farmhouse. The horror is not cosmic intrusion, but cosmic entanglement. The narrative begins with a local disturbance: the birth of Wilbur Whately, a precocious and rapidly aging child born to a mad woman and an unknown father. The villagers note that Wilbur's development is unnatural. He was not like other folks, grew too fast, talked too well for his age. This early emphasis on biological difference, presented through gossip and suspicion, slowly turns to dread. Lovecraft uses regional dialects, historical references, and agricultural details to ground the story in reality. The intrusion of the mythos happens slowly beneath this layer of familiarity until the local becomes existentially unstable. The key reveal arrives. Gradually, Wilbur is only one of two offspring. His twin, invisible, massive, and non-human, is confined to the attic and later roams the hills, unseen but not unfelt. Livestock vanish, strange footprints appear, buildings collapse. Lovecraft draws the reader into an invisible catastrophe. The twin is never shown directly, but its presence overwhelms the story. This tactic, suggestion through effect, aligns with Lovecraft's core technique. The horror is not what you see, but what cannot be fully described. When the invisible entity is finally revealed to be the son of Yog-Sothoth, the collapse is not merely spatial or narrative, it is ontological. We must pause here. The invocation of Yog-Sothoth represents a philosophical escalation. Unlike Cthulhu, who operates through dreams and presence, Yog-Sothoth is a principle more than a figure. He is described as the key and the gate, existing simultaneously across all time and space. In this story, he mates with a human woman, not metaphorically, but physically, producing children that embody temporal and dimensional instability. One twin is human-looking, but alien in behavior. The other is vast, invisible, and warps the world around it. The horror is not that these creatures exist, but that they are partly us. The climactic scene, where the invisible twin climbs atop a mountain and is banished by scholars chanting in Latin, is often misunderstood as a moment of triumph. But the content of the twin's final cry reframes the entire story. I don't want to go back to the dad. I want to stay with you. I hate it. This is not the howl of a monster. It is the scream of something that wants to belong, but cannot. The line introduces pathos, even tragedy. The entity has awareness, a sense of self, of desire, of separation. This moment fractures the human-non-human divide. The horror is no longer just external, it is internalized. Thematically, the Dunwich Horror introduces a new dimension to Lovecraft's mythos, heredity. The Whateleys are not victims of random cosmic contact. They seek it out. Old Whateley studies the Necronomicon, performs rituals, and breeds with intention. The family actively invites the mythos into their bloodline. This is a profound shift. Cthulhu's cults are peripheral, scattered across the globe. The Whateleys are central, domestic, and intentional. The horror is not that the old ones return. It is that some humans want them to, and will become their vessels. This connection between humanity and the outer gods complicates the mythos. It blurs categories. Yog-Sothoth is both distant and genealogical. The horror is not only scale, but proximity. Lovecraft uses the rural setting, the decaying farmhouse, the suspicious townsfolk, the half-forgotten rituals, to suggest that the greatest threats are not in space, but in local memory, reproductive choices, and ancestral knowledge. Myth is not discovered, it is inherited. In mythos terms, this story further integrates key concepts. The Necronomicon, Miskatonic University, ritual banishment, and the classification of entities not as demons or aliens, but as dimensional constants. The idea of invisible monsters would echo through later stories like The Whisperer in Darkness and The Color Out of Space. But the Dunwich Horror is unique in giving the entity a voice, a final, childlike lament that undermines the simple dichotomy of good and evil. In the next section, we move beyond Lovecraft himself. We examine how later collaborators, especially August Derleth, attempted to build coherence out of contradiction. Their efforts to classify, moralize, and expand the mythos reveal both the appeal and the difficulty of systematizing something that was always designed to remain unstable. After Lovecraft's death in 1937, his mythos did not end. It mutated. The figures he left, shadowed and unstable, were soon drawn into systems of classification, theology, and narrative, resolution by his successors. Chief among them was August Derleth, a devoted correspondent and posthumous publisher of Lovecraft's work, who, perhaps unintentionally, transformed a body of literature rooted in epistemic collapse into a more familiar structure of cosmic struggle. This shift marked the beginning of the systematized mythos, a development both expansive and reductive. Derleth's primary contribution was to impose moral dualism onto Lovecraft's fundamentally amoral cosmos. He grouped the entities into elemental categories: earth, air, fire, water, and organized them along a binary axis. The elder gods, benevolent or neutral protectors, versus the great old ones, malevolent forces bent on destruction. Yog-Sothoth became of time, Cthulhu of water, and so on. But Lovecraft's fiction had always resisted such symmetry. The terror of his monsters lay in their indifference, not in opposition. To cast them as villains in a war of good versus evil is to domesticate the horror, to make it narratively legible in a way Lovecraft himself avoided. We must pause here. Derleth was not merely misreading. He was adapting, trying to preserve Lovecraft's legacy by translating it into more familiar mythic patterns. He coined the term Cthulhu mythos, encouraged other writers to contribute, and built Arkham House to publish and promote Lovecraftian fiction. Without him, much of Lovecraft's work might have remained out of print. Yet this act of preservation came at a philosophical cost. Where Lovecraft implied that the universe was without moral shape, Derleth implied that its horror could be resisted, categorized, and perhaps even defeated. This transformation is visible in stories like The Lurker at the Threshold, 1945, which Derleth completed from Lovecraft's fragments. It retains elements of cosmic dread, rituals, old books, unseen beings, but concludes with the successful banishment of the monstrous force. The outcome is optimistic by mythos standards. Knowledge, though dangerous, is effective. Ritual works. The evil is stopped. These resolutions contradict Lovecraft's core logic, that understanding is destabilizing, and that no final containment is possible. Derleth's stories offer closure. Lovecraft's stories resist it. Despite this shift, the collaborative expansion had a generative effect. Writers like Clark Ashton Smith, Robert E. Howard, and later Ramsey Campbell, Brian Lumley, and Caitlin R. Kiernan added new entities, geographies, and tonal variations. Some embraced Derleth's taxonomy. Others pushed against it. Smith, for instance, approached cosmic entities with poetic irony, emphasizing aesthetic estrangement over moral structure. Kiernan, decades later, would return to epistemic horror, writing stories in which Lovecraftian themes resurfaced not as creatures, but as mental disturbances that refuse interpretation. In the late 20th century, the mythos migrated beyond fiction. Tabletop role-playing games, most notably Call of Cthulhu in 1981, transformed the horror into interactive narrative. Players studied the Necronomicon, summoned monsters, and fought cults. While thematically at odds with Lovecraft's vision, the possibility of player agency contradicts his fatalism. These games cemented the mythos in popular culture. Even here, though, the original motifs survived in distorted form. Sanity mechanics, investigative decay, and the inability to truly win. We must also consider the digital and fan-driven expansions of the 21st century. Creepypasta forums, analog horror series, and digital ARGs, alternate reality games, have embraced the structure of Lovecraftian horror, fragmented documents, unknowable forces, identity breakdown. Projects like the SCP Foundation or Local 58 exhibit clear mythos DNA, documents written with academic detachment, monsters that are functions more than characters, and a persistent suggestion that knowledge is corrosive. These newer texts do not always cite Lovecraft, but they inherit his method, reality rewritten through exposure. The mythos today is vast, contradictory, and self-renewing. No single version dominates. Derleth's elemental system coexists with stories that reject all taxonomy. Cthulhu appears in board games, plush toys, and metal albums, as parody, as reverence, as noise. And yet, at the mythos' center, something remains disturbingly intact. The idea that truth does not liberate, that understanding may be a form of annihilation, continues to unsettle even through commercial reinterpretation. In the next section, we turn from literature to belief, exploring how these fictional beings have leaked into cultural rumor, modern folklore, and reports of real sightings. The mythos, we will see, did not remain contained in stories. It began to behave like myth, fragmented, shared, and half-believed. There is a strange moment that occurs when fiction persists long enough to be mistaken for history. With Lovecraft's monsters, that moment has happened repeatedly. What began as literary invention, shaped by philosophy, science, and dread, has steadily slipped into something else: urban folklore. Over the past half-century, reports have surfaced of sightings of Cthulhu-like entities, leaked government documents referencing the Necronomicon, and entire subcultures that treat Lovecraft's beings not as metaphors, but as potential realities. The mythos has, in places, escaped its genre. The shift began quietly in pulp fandoms of the 1960s and 70s, where Lovecraft's relative obscurity made him an ideal source for speculative belief. The Necronomicon, originally invented as a fictional grimoire, began to appear in real-world catalogs of occult literature. By 1977, a hoax edition of the book was published by Simon, complete with rituals, invocations, and Mesopotamian references. Though clearly fabricated, it was taken seriously by segments of the occult community, the very structure of Lovecraft's fiction. Fragmented texts, uncertain authorship, suppressed knowledge invited this ambiguity. The mythos mimicked real conspiracy before conspiracy culture mainstreamed it. We must pause here. Lovecraft did not intend this outcome. His horror was anti-mystical, rooted in materialism and scientific pessimism. But the mythos' vagueness, the suggestion of deep history, unreliable narrators, and institutional silence, created the perfect vessel for parafiction. Fictional narratives designed to be half-believed. In the digital age, this tendency accelerated. Cthulhu was blamed for mass whale beachings. Deep-sea sonar anomalies were linked to sunken cities. YouTube channels dissect government footage, allegedly showing non-Euclidean ruins on the ocean floor. Most viewers know it's fiction, but the frame has changed. Doubt has become part of the entertainment. Creepypasta culture deepened this transformation. Stories like The Rake and Slender Man owe much to Lovecraft's indirect horror. They emerged anonymously, spread through message boards, and adopted the mythos model. Entity-first storytelling, framed through recovered evidence and pseudo-academic tone. Slender Man's early depictions mimic Nyarlathotep, not physically, but structurally, a tall, unknowable being whose influence spreads through dreams, madness, and suggestibility. The 2014 Slender Man stabbing in Wisconsin marked a chilling convergence: fiction influencing belief, belief producing violence. Here, Lovecraft's legacy re-emerged not as monster, but as method. ARGs, alternate reality games, have also embraced Lovecraftian structures. Series like Local 58, Gemini Home Entertainment, and the Mandela Catalog incorporate cosmic horror through implied mythology, scrambled timelines, and hostile environments that do not register as threats in conventional ways. These projects rarely mention Cthulhu or Yog-Sothoth by name. Instead, they adopt the logic of the mythos: unstable knowledge, hostile awareness, environmental manipulation. Viewers become investigators, piecing together narrative fragments that never resolve. The audience's desire for coherence becomes part of the horror. But perhaps the most intriguing expression of the mythos as folklore lies in online claims of real sightings. Forums occasionally surface threads from individuals who believe they encountered something matching the description of Lovecraftian beings: vast silhouettes in ocean storms, symbols seen in dreams, blackouts linked to geometric hallucinations. Some of these are fiction, others are role play, but some resist classification. Their authors insist they are not fans. They have not read Lovecraft. They only describe what they saw. Whether hoax or not, these reports mimic the structure of Lovecraft's own stories: a narrator encountering something that ruins explanation. This phenomenon reveals something deeper. Myth does not require belief. It only requires circulation. The more the mythos fragments, the more it mimics real folklore: regional variants, contradictory traditions, half-remembered rituals. Lovecraft's monsters now occupy the same imaginative terrain as Bigfoot or UFOs, not as creatures to be confirmed, but as structures of unease that explain the unexplainable. In this sense, the mythos has fulfilled its original logic. It was never about monsters. It was about the conditions under which monsters become plausible. In the next section, we will trace how these conditions have been translated into modern media, film, games, and music, and how each medium has struggled in different ways to express horror that cannot be seen, explained, or resolved. The mythos, once literary, has become transmedial, but its essence, ambiguity, implication, rupture, remains intact. Translating Lovecraft's mythos into other media has always posed a paradox. How do you represent that which is defined by its inability to be represented? His monsters were never meant to appear fully. Their horror depended on illusion, on the failure of description, on the after effects of perception rather than the spectacle itself. When modern adaptations attempt to visualize these entities, on film, in games, in music, they often struggle with the risk of clarity. What once disturbed through suggestion now risks becoming merely visible. We must begin with cinema, which has long circled Lovecraft without fully landing. The Thing, 1982, directed by John Carpenter, is often cited as a successful Lovecraftian film, though it contains no direct references. The creature in The Thing resists stable form, destroys identity, and eludes understanding, hallmarks of the mythos. But unlike Lovecraft's monsters, Carpenter's creature is aggressively predatory. It acts with purpose. It attacks. In Lovecraft, the terror is not in the attack, but in recognition. When Cthulhu rises, he does not pursue. He is seen. The terror arrives from within. Films that attempt direct adaptation often misstep by pursuing visual accuracy. The Call of Cthulhu, 2005, a silent, low-budget homage, succeeds precisely because it avoids realism. Its use of silent-era aesthetics and black-and-white abstraction keeps the entity distant. Conversely, larger productions like The Mist, 2007, evoke mythos-scale entities through towering creatures and thick fog, but ultimately resolve the terror through narrative action. The core of Lovecraft's horror, unresolvable knowledge, often collapses when forced into a three-act structure. Resolution is the enemy of the mythos. Games, however, have proven more successful. Titles like Bloodborne 2015 and Darkest Dungeon 2016 draw deeply from Lovecraft's themes, not through plot, but through structure. In Bloodborne, the player begins by fighting beasts, but eventually encounters ancient, unknowable beings whose influence corrupts perception itself. Insight becomes a stat. Gaining too much reveals more of the world, but also causes hallucinations. This mechanic is Lovecraftian not just in flavor, but in function. Knowledge destabilizes. Progress induces madness. The game does not just show the mythos, it replicates its logic. Call of Cthulhu, Dark Corners of the Earth, 2005, goes further, integrating sanity as a gameplay element. Exposure to certain environments, sites, or texts depletes the player's mental stability, altering the screen and eventually causing loss of control. These systems echo the central Lovecraftian principle. Understanding is not rewarded. Where most games associate knowledge with mastery, mythos-based titles reverse this. To know more is to risk everything. We must also consider music, where Lovecraft's influence spreads less directly, but with surprising depth. Metal genres, particularly black and doom metal, have adopted mythos themes since the 1980s. Bands like Nile, Electric Wizard, and Sun O reference Yog-Sothoth, Cthulhu, or ancient tomes, often drawing lyrical parallels between sonic intensity and cosmological collapse. In these cases, Lovecraft's influence is not narrative, it is atmospheric. The music seeks to evoke the same sensations: scale, distortion, erasure. Dissonant tones, ambiguous rhythms, and sheer volume act as sonic analogues to non-Euclidean geometry. Electronic and ambient composers have followed similar paths. Artists like Brian Eno, Lustmord, and Mount Shrine have created soundscapes that mimic the internal logic of mythos spaces. Endless caverns, distant whispers, the suggestion of structure without form. These compositions do not illustrate Lovecraft's beings. They simulate their environments, where time slows and perception thickens. Sound becomes space. Presence becomes implication. Despite these innovations, no medium has fully captured the mythos. This is not failure. It is inevitability. Lovecraft's creatures resist translation because their terror is epistemic, not aesthetic. They are not frightening because of how they look, but because of what they imply. They render knowledge toxic, reality unstable, and meaning unreachable. Any adaptation that resolves these tensions through plot, visuals, or mechanics risks betraying the source. And yet, these risks are often taken because the mythos continues to exert cultural gravity. In the next section, we turn from media to meaning, examining how the mythos has been adopted, reinterpreted, and theorized by subcultures and academics alike. No longer confined to fiction, Lovecraft's entities now haunt philosophy, anthropology, and internet meme culture. They are not just monsters, they are models for breakdown, for alienation, for truths too large to manage. Lovecraft's monsters no longer belong to Lovecraft. Over the past 50 years, they've migrated out of fiction and into subcultures, memes, and academic discourse. What began as literary horror now circulates as a shared symbolic system, a way of expressing ideas about reality, identity, and collapse. Cthulhu is as likely to appear on a philosophy syllabus or a Discord server as in a horror anthology. The mythos has become toolkit, metaphor, and joke, often all at once. Subcultures were the first to embrace this flexibility. The internet's early forums, Usenet, 4chan, Reddit, treated the mythos less as canon and more as open source material. Memes like Cthulhu for President Why settle for the lesser evil? Reframed the entity as political satire. On one level, the joke works because Cthulhu is vast, uncaring, and destructive. On another, it captures a deeper feeling that modern political systems are so impersonal, so vast, that they feel non-human. The monster becomes a metaphor for systems that function without empathy. We must pause here. Irony has become the dominant mode of engagement with the mythos, but irony does not neutralize meaning. It often protects the very concepts it parodies. When users refer to existential dread as that Yog-Sothoth feeling, they are using mythos language to index affect, to signal emotional conditions, overwhelm, alienation, disorientation, that traditional language struggles to express. Lovecraft's monsters, stripped of their original narrative contexts, become symbols of psychological states in the digital age. Academia, too, has absorbed the mythos, not just in literature departments, but in philosophy, media theory, and anthropology. The rise of speculative realism in the early 2000s marked a turning point. Thinkers like Graham Harman and Eugene Thacker began referencing Lovecraft explicitly as a philosopher of the unthinkable. Harman described Lovecraft's monsters as objects that withdraw from human access, visible in part, never fully known. Thacker, in the Dust of This Planet, 2011, positioned the mythos as a model for a world that remains ontologically separate from our descriptions of it. Anthropology has likewise found use in the mythos. Scholars studying ritual, secrecy, and cultural memory have drawn parallels between Lovecraft's cults and real-world esoteric traditions, not to equate them, but to explore how hidden knowledge functions socially. In this lens, the Necronomicon operates like any forbidden text, not dangerous because of what it says, but because of how it positions the reader. To read it is to step outside consensus reality. The same could be said of taboo histories, contested archives, or sacred indigenous cosmologies. Lovecraft's mythos becomes a frame for thinking about frames. Even architecture and visual design have absorbed mythos logic. Non-Euclidean geometry, once a mathematical abstraction, now appears in horror games, liminal space aesthetics, and surreal memes. The idea of forbidden shapes has become shorthand for destabilized perception. Entire TikTok subcultures exist around back rooms and impossible buildings, spaces that resemble mythos architecture in tone, if not source. These are not just jokes or scares. They are acts of framing, ways to simulate what it feels like when space, time, or memory lose their coherence. At the same time, scholars have begun reckoning with Lovecraft's personal contradictions. His racism, xenophobia, and cultural elitism are well documented, and they shape his fiction profoundly. Some critics argue that his horror emerges not just from cosmic perspective, but from fear of the other, cultural, biological, racial. Subcultural responses vary. Some embrace the mythos while rejecting the man. Others appropriate it to critique systems of knowledge and control. In this way, the mythos becomes a contested site, a space where horror, critique, and creativity intersect. The flexibility of Lovecraft's creations, their symbolic looseness, their refusal to settle, makes them ideal for appropriation. They are unfinished concepts, constantly reinterpreted, whether in academic theory, internet culture, or grassroots spirituality. They endure not as fixed monsters, but as floating signs of unease. In the final section, we will explore why this unease persists, why, even in parody, Lovecraft's monsters still haunt the edge of thought. The question is no longer, what are they? But why do we keep returning to them? Lovecraft's monsters have endured not because they are terrifying to look at, but because they continue to work. Across generations, genres, and platforms, they survive reinterpretation because their true function was never visual or narrative. It was conceptual. They embody the edges of human thought. When modern audiences return to Cthulhu, Yog-Sothoth, or Azathoth, they are not merely revisiting a fictional mythos. They are confronting persistent psychological and philosophical dilemmas that fiction alone cannot contain. Consider first the psychological dimension. Lovecraft's monsters externalize what psychoanalysis might call the trauma of realization. Cthulhu is not a threat to life, but to structure. His rising from the sea symbolizes not invasion, but disclosure. The world is not what we believed. There is no plan. The mind, confronted with this, either breaks or adapts. In many stories, this breach results in madness. But madness in Lovecraft is not irrationality. It is the inability to return to a previously functional delusion. The mythos makes visible the cost of expanded awareness. We must pause here. Why does this remain compelling in the 21st century? Because the existential dilemmas Lovecraft expressed, cosmic indifference, human insignificance, the breakdown of stable categories, have not diminished. If anything, they have intensified. Climate collapse, artificial intelligence, deep time geology, and astrophysics all challenge the human-centered worldview. The more we understand, the less central we appear. Lovecraft's monsters do not represent these forces literally. They foreshadowed the psychological cost of encountering them. Azathoth, formless, mindless, yet cosmically central, anticipates a universe where agency is absent, but causality persists. Yog-Sothoth, embodying all of space-time at once, gestures toward realities that our linear perception cannot grasp. Shub-Niggurath's excessive fertility reflects the horror of function without purpose. These monsters persist not as characters, but as thought experiments. They simulate what it means to encounter something too large, too alien, or too indifferent to coexist with our sense of self. Philosophically, the mythos maps neatly onto post-structuralist thought. Thinkers like Michel Foucault and Jean-François Lyotard argued that knowledge systems are always partial, contingent, and embedded in power. Lovecraft dramatized this decades earlier. The Necronomicon is not terrifying because of what it says, but because it reveals the instability of all knowledge. Its function is corrosive. It does not offer mastery. It dissolves the framework in which mastery was possible. This is why his stories so often end not in death, but in epistemic paralysis. To know is to be trapped in the known. The mythos also anticipates current debates in speculative realism and object-oriented ontology. In these traditions, the central insight is that the world does not need human observers to exist. Objects withdraw from perception. Systems operate without us. Lovecraft's horror begins from the same premise, that we are not central, not exceptional, and not equipped to comprehend what surrounds us. This perspective is not meant to induce despair, but it does induce displacement. We are no longer the axis. We are one phenomenon among many, and yet the mythos endures not just in dread, but in attraction. Why do people return to these stories, these symbols, these impossible names? Perhaps because they offer a kind of honesty. They refuse to console. They offer no redemption arc, no triumphant return. Into a culture saturated with resolution and moral closure, Lovecraft's monsters offer something else, the opportunity to sit with what cannot be resolved. They give shape to formless anxieties, not to solve them, but to articulate their presence. This final point matters. The mythos persists not in spite of its ambiguity, but because of it. In Lovecraft's cosmos, the monsters never truly leave. They slumber, they whisper, they circulate. The stories end, but the implications remain suspended. There is no final confrontation, no final victory. Only the reader, aware, uncertain, and altered. So we close, not with an answer, but with a condition. Lovecraft's monsters endure because they are no longer only fiction. They have become part of how we think about the limits of thought. And though their forms may change, from story to screen, from meme to theory, the dread they carry remains. Something has been glimpsed. Something too large, too quiet, too real, and it is still there,